input that they're having in terms of reaching out to some of those children that you've highlighted. And you've made a very important point about the concerns that I know that you feel, and I'm sure that many people on the committee feel, but also something that's shared by myself and the whole department, about actually the concern of children falling behind. And it's all children that we're concerned about falling behind, but there are particular concerns about those children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds and how we can do everything we can to help them. We've got to be honest with people that actually taking children out of school for a period of time is not what any of us would want to see, and it does mean that they miss out on a lot of schooling. What we're needing to do is look at different ways that we can actually help and support those children to be to ensure that we don't see them falling behind further, and we have the opportunity for them to be able to gain on that learning. You highlight a particular area in terms of a digital divide, and this was a concern that I had in terms of how children were going to, from especially the most disadvantaged backgrounds, were going to be able to access a lot of learning and a lot of brilliant learning that we've got on the internet. And this is why we'd embarked on the programme of providing, over £100 million worth of digital resources, of 200,000 laptops for those children from the most challenging backgrounds.
I mean, does the department know? I would strongly welcome that initiative, and we'll come on to that later. But does the department know how long pupils are spending learning each day, and the extent to which that is affected by their socio-economic position?
Well, we don't at the moment have that data. I mean, one of your earlier points was also the number of children who are attending school, especially those children from classed as a vulnerable category. And we were one of the first countries, in fact, we were the first country that actually gave the opportunity for vulnerable children to be able to continue to attend school through this crisis. But we have been concerned about the numbers of those children actually attending school. So over the Easter period, both social services, but also schools themselves made an enormous effort in terms of reaching out to those vulnerable children to encourage them to come into school. And we've seen a doubling in the number of children from that vulnerable category that have been attending school.
And has the department started to calculate the likely effect that school closures will have on the attainment gap?
Yeah, well, we've been working with the Education Endowment Foundation, which is obviously something that was set up a number of years ago in order to give absolutely evidence-based information as to where the challenges are in terms of education and how we develop the best policies in order to deal with that. And we're working with the Education Endowment Foundation, as well as the Sutton Trust, as well as doing our own internal work in terms of how we put in resources that are going to best able to help children to be able to recover and make sure that they get all the resources that they need in order to get the best education.
You mentioned the laptop scheme, which is a great scheme, and I'm sure that lots of parents and schools will be thanking you for that. But does the department know how many disadvantaged learners are not eligible for the free laptop scheme, and what are your plans for those particular individuals?
Sorry, could you repeat that question again?
Yeah, does the department know how many disadvantaged learners are not eligible for the free laptop scheme, and what are the plans for those individuals to make sure that they have access to some kind of online learning?
So the reason that we'd established the laptop scheme was because we're conscious that there are certain people at critical moments of their education where they were going to be facing challenges in terms of exams in the near future. We needed to put those that resource in place. So as a first priority, we wanted to get that resource to them. Obviously, we're looking very closely as to how this is going to work. And if it works well and if resources is used in making a big impact in terms of those children's learning, it's something that we'd like to look at. Is it something that could be expanded? Is it something that's worth expanding? But we wanted, this is a pretty substantial trial of an investment of £100 million, but we wanted to make sure that this has the real impact that we're expecting and hoping it does.
In terms of vulnerable children, there are some charities and organisations like the Safeguarding Alliance who say that there are new vulnerabilities that are being found. There's a new frontier of vulnerabilities in terms of affecting children, children being affected by mental health, children who have access to potential serious online harms. Are you assessing those kind of different vulnerabilities that may emerge, even though they may not be classed under existing list of vulnerable children?
We absolutely are, and this is something that we've been working very closely with the Home Office and the Home Secretary on, in terms of looking at a whole range of different harms and vulnerabilities that children may be exposed to. And we've sadly always seen in times of crisis, sometimes the predatory behaviours emerge and people using the crisis in order to be able to exploit children. And this is why the work that we've been doing with the Home Office is so vital. And I'd like to pay tribute to both the Home Secretary, who has driven this incredibly hard in terms of all the work that she's been doing in the Home Office, working with social services, but also working with schools. And you've got a very high level of collaboration about how we're trying to tackle some of these increasing dangers that we may actually sort of...
Just to go back to what I was saying, does the DfE have a clear picture about exactly what's happening to vulnerable children who are not attending school? And are you satisfied that those children who are not attending, that there are adequate measures in place to ensure their safety?
Well, this is why you've seen a lot of work through social services, but also working closely with schools, making sure that there's regular contact with those children. Just because they're not in school doesn't mean to say that the work that social services are doing isn't incredibly far-ranging, to making sure that they're constantly working with those children, working with those families, making sure that they have the support that's needed. But we recognise that actually the pressures in this area are actually grown. This is why we took the measures to increase the number and pool of people that could come back into social services work. We extended that pool by 8,000. I'm pleased to report to the committee that over 1,000 social workers have come back into the service in order to help us at this quite extraordinary time.
We talked about the digital divide. Most homes, 95%, have a TV station. Have you had any thoughts about perhaps working with the BBC or other broadcasting services to provide a long-term national education service on television that would broadcast a few hours a day and people could access through a red button what year they were in? So those children who don't have access to computers would at least be able to get an education at home if they're not attending school.
This is something that we have been working very closely with the BBC on, and I've had a number of meetings with Director General of the BBC, Tony Lord Hall, in order to discuss this exact issue. And if I can take the opportunity to thank the BBC for launching the largest ever education programme that they've had in the corporation's history, recognising the point that people don't always have a laptop or a sort of some form of sort of a tablet in their home, and recognising a TV is a great way of doing that. We've been working closely with the BBC. They've got an extensive programme. We are always very keen to see how we could make that a more extensive programme. And recognising the fact that most people have a TV in their house where they're not necessarily going to have a computer. But if we are in a position where we could do more with the BBC and the BBC is able to make more available, we're incredibly keen to do that with them. And we've been providing them with guidance as to how best to do that, and also making people available who can best be able to guide them and put the best resource on TV for children.
And as we move, hopefully, towards the aftermath of this awful disease, we've talked about the according to the Sutton Trust. Do you support the idea that I floated and provide extra tuition, extra mentoring for these disadvantaged or vulnerable pupils who may not have attended school one way or the other and may be way behind, and perhaps that catch-up premium supported by a nationwide network of volunteers, of graduates, of retired teachers, of perhaps OFSTED inspectors who may have who are, a lot of them are former teachers who may be able to join a volunteer scheme in the way that the government has done with the NHS volunteer scheme, helping existing schools, supporting vulnerable children, both at the present and in the aftermath of this disease.
Mr. Chairman, I do apologise. You froze at a number of points during that question, but I think I got the gist and thrust of it. But if I don't sort of touch upon any particular point, if you could maybe come back on that. I'd like to think that we're actually a bit ahead of you in terms of you've talked about the catch-up premium. We actually recognise that we need to put in a whole set of different measures to help all children, and this is why we've launched the Oak National Academy. This is why we've started to put more resources online. This is why we're working very closely with schools to actually start looking at how we can sort of plan resources best in the future to make sure that children from whatever background they come from are helped. But there is a particular issue with some children who are most disadvantaged. And why I say that I'd like to think that we're sort of getting a bit of ahead of what you were suggesting is the fact that we're already making that £100 million investment in terms of IT equipment to reach out to some of those most disadvantaged children. We're also very closely working with the Education Endowment Foundation about the concept of pilots, about actually how best we can do targeted support for some of those most disadvantaged children. And we've set up a whole set of stream of work about how, in terms of recovery from this, how we can pick up some of those children who are most disadvantaged, how we can put in place those interventions that will ensure that they don't suffer any form of educational disadvantage, how we can help them. But what we do on that, I want it to be very targeted support that makes a big impact in terms of those children who need that.
And would you consider this being, I mean, are you considering a nationwide volunteer scheme of former teachers, of perhaps some OFSTED inspectors, of graduates to help schools mentor and provide tuition for left behind pupils?
Well, we're discussing it, and we're doing quite a considerable amount of work on a whole different and range of aspects of policies. Those policies are not yet ready to be launched. When they are, obviously, we'll be sharing that with the committee. But we are looking at different ways about how we can use the enormous volunteer army of people that have come forward, many of with past education experience, many of with an awful lot of knowledge in specialist subjects. We've been working incredibly closely with OFSTED, who have been incredibly important in terms of supplementing and working with the department in order to support many different aspects of education. So we're very open to these ideas, but we've got a whole train of different pieces of work as to how we can support pupils. But at the moment, coming to this committee, I'm afraid I'm not in a position to be able to announce what those policies are going to be.
And do you have a date when the schools will open?
Apart from obviously what we've already announced in terms of the digital £100 million investment that we've made. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I did mean to. Did you ask me as to whether we'd got a date as to when schools will open? Yeah. We are working very closely with the whole sector in terms of actually when is going to be the best time to bring schools fully back into operation. We have set out 5 clear tests as to what's incredibly important and what will inform the opening of the schools. We want to make sure that schools are given proper notice, but we do not have a date as to when schools are going to be opening.
Do you imagine when they do open, it will be in stages? And would you favour primary opening first or secondary schools opening first?
This is obviously something that we are giving a great amount of thought to, and we're giving a lot of consideration. Just a couple of weeks ago, I commissioned Sage to set up a subgroup to look at the particular issues of opening schools, making sure that when schools are open, it's done in the best possible way with the very best scientific and medical advice. And we expect Sage to reporting back, and the information that we get from Sage, along with Public Health England, will be the key parts of what informs us to how best we open schools. But I do expect schools to be opened in a phased manner. I also intend to be giving schools as much notice as possible in order to be able to ensure.
And should they open in the should they open in the summer holidays to help left behind?
We seem to have lost the chairman now. Are you back, Robert? You froze there.
I'm here. Yeah. Yes, I am. Yeah. Should we schools for left behind pupils?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're asking as to whether we are planning to open schools during the summer, and we're not planning to run schools through the summer. But as I was talking about earlier, what we are doing is we're looking at a whole set of interventions to help children both catch up in terms of their work across the whole broad setting of children of all backgrounds, but we're also looking at different interventions that we can make in order to be able to help children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds.
Okay, my final question, just before I pass to my colleagues, is we know that support staff are often the unsung heroes of the lockdown, and without them, none of the schools would be able to remain open. The government's guidance says that PPE isn't needed in most cases, yet acknowledges that social distancing is harder to maintain in education settings. And what's the scientific basis for saying that most teachers or support staff do not need PPE?
Mr. Chairman, do you mind repeating the question, because I think it sort of blanked out at possibly the most important part of it.
Yeah, so the government's official guidance says that PPE is not needed in most cases, and yet acknowledges that social distancing is harder to maintain in education settings. How is the government reconciling these two positions, and are they contradictory? And what's the scientific basis for saying that most teachers or support staff do not need PPE?
Well, as you can imagine, we turn to Public Health England in terms of actually giving us the very best advice in terms of protecting both the workforce and also for children. We've constantly asked them for guidance as to how best to deal with both school settings, both primary and secondary school, but also special schools as well. And at every stage, when we're looking at, as we reopen schools in a phased manner, the reason that we commissioned the SAGE subgroup to look at this is to make sure they're giving us the best scientific advice. And then as we're opening schools in a phased manner, we'll make sure that we're consulting with Public Health England to make sure that we're getting the very best advice in terms of protecting children and in terms of protecting staff.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in very quickly Tom, Ian and Jonathan, then pass over to David Simmons because they have questions. Tom first, and Fleur. So just some quick questions from them, and then we'll pass over to David. Tom.
Good morning, Secretary of State. I've just got it does concern me that the rates of the Sutton Trust findings in terms of the percentage of children who are every day logging into these online lessons, and how I think it's about 17% is the level for some of those from a disadvantaged backgrounds. I have spoken to a couple of head teachers who have actually had very high levels of participation every day, and one of the things that they do is have a live roll call every morning, and they make it so that the children have to register for every class, and if they don't, then they call the parents. It seems to be working quite well there. I just wanted to know what the Department for Education guidance is to schools regarding registration, roll calls at the start of the day, and whether you think that could lead to higher attendance at the moment during COVID.
Of course. Tom, I think that's a very valid point, and it's what we've been trying to do in terms of putting out more and more guidance to schools. It gives them a greater sense of what is actually working, and we've been working with a lot of schools right across the country. I mean, the reason we created the Oak National Academy was actually to give a very structured form of learning that anyone would be able to access. We're very keen for schools to do everything they can do to be engaging with their pupils, to giving them a sense that education can continue in a different way as to how it would be in school, but sort of giving children as much structure as possible. And there's some brilliant examples, but how we get those brilliant examples and scale that up across the country is something that we've been attempting to do by sharing more guidance and a greater sense of what's working, how it can work, and helping schools to deliver that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan, are you there?
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Secretary of State, and I wish you and your family all the best, and obviously during this crisis. Coming back to the Chair's point regarding the kids going back over the summer holidays, my great fear, and I'm sure that of yourself, is that Year 11 and Year 13 especially missed out on a crucial learning of what it's like to sit an exam and obviously be rewarded for what they've done, and they would have been away from school for such a prolonged period of time, especially the Year 13s. Obviously, we normally have the National Citizenship Service that runs through the summer break. Is there any way that we can ensure, especially Year 11 and 13 students, can do some voluntary work within the community to ensure that they're engaged and motivated while they don't have the academic pressure of an exam sitting over them?
Yeah. So if I could start off by paying tribute to, I know the amazing work that you've been doing with your schools in Stoke-on-Trent North, and obviously bringing your talents as a teacher to very much to use to support your constituents. A lot of this depends in terms of the scientific and medical advice that we get in terms of what we can lay on in terms of best supporting those children. I think there's a real challenge in a number of transition years, and you highlight those who are in Year 11 and those who are in Year 13. And we have particular concerns about children in those years who may not wish to exploit some of the further education opportunities that may be available to them, either through further education colleges or universities. So we're looking at how we can do reach out work to them to make sure that they are aware of those opportunities. In terms of the idea of volunteering schemes, this is something that we would very much like to see, but we are a little bit dependent on the scientific and medical advice as to what can be laid on, what can be done. And I know this is something that the National Citizenship Service has been looking at very closely as to how it can be done. And in the department, we've been doing work to see as to, is there activities that we can be putting on through the summer for youngsters? It was looking slightly more broadly, not just at those particular two year groups, not just in terms of helping them in terms of education, but actually putting them in connection with young people again after they've had this long period of social isolation.
Okay, Fleur, if you wanted a quick question.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State. I just want to ask a couple more questions about the laptops. In my area, we're scrabbling around getting voluntary contributions of laptops, and some charities are helping, but we don't know when the rollout of the laptop scheme is happening. So could I just ask you again about what's the likely time frame of the rollout of the laptop and the accompanying data, which is proving even more important for many families? And also, is that just for England, or is it Scotland and Wales as well?
Firstly, it is just for England in terms of where we're doing the laptop scheme, as these matters are devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In terms of a time frame, this week we'll be writing to all local authorities and multi-academy trusts to give them a clear indication as to what the allocations that they'll be receiving in terms of this rollout of digital equipment. And we expect the first laptops to be arriving at the end of May, with the majority delivered through June. We do not see this rollout of digital equipment to be something that is just to deal with the challenge that we're facing today. We see this as part of addressing the longer term problem in terms of actually helping children get what they need in terms of their learning as rapidly as possible over the summer period and going into the next academic year as well.
Thank you.
Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. Regarding the potential for phased reopening or reopening of schools, many of our schools, of course, are still open. Here in Gateshead, I know of schools which are still doing what they're meant to be doing, and that is looking after the youngsters of key workers and youngsters with vulnerabilities and disadvantage. But the numbers are very low. I think the sort of numbers that we've heard talked about, 1% before Easter, and schools that I'm aware of about 3 or 4% of pupils actually physically coming in. Now, social distancing is absolutely possible in that sort of circumstance, but even on a phased return, we'd have to think about youngsters not being in school probably more than 25% of the roll at once in order to have any chance of keeping the social distancing rules in operation. Otherwise, what we do know about the potential for asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 could still be significantly a danger. And the guidance regarding what's required in schools regarding PPE and social distancing really does need to be updated, because the guidance that we've seen for the care settings has been constantly updated and moved on quite a lot since this whole business started. So we do need to think about that very, very carefully, Secretary of State.
Ian, I think you raise an important point, is when we enter the next phase of dealing with this crisis, and as we look at having a phased return of schools, we'll have to constantly look at how we update the advice and give teachers and those who work in schools, as well as nurseries and colleges, the very best advice in terms of making sure that they create a safe space. It is incredibly important that we get the right balance in terms of actually making sure that we create an environment that is good to learn in, but also that is a safe environment for people to both work in and learn in as well.
Okay, thank you. David, been waiting very patiently. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State. Very much echo your comments about how the sector stepped up to support children. 2 questions about reopening and PPE. I've been speaking to a lot of head teachers in the constituency about what their plans are, and in particular, multi-academy local authorities looking at what they can do over the summer for catch-up. Flags 2 issues. The first is around the risk assessment for vulnerable children. SEND schools in particular have said they already have supplies of personal protective equipment for any child where they would routinely expect to need it. But some of those children have particular medical vulnerabilities, and they really want on the department's radar the need to do effective risk assessments, and that forms part of any reopening plan. So your view about that risk assessment process. And then the second issue, more generally about opening, a number of those schools and local authorities, multi-academy trusts have said they are already planning to open up for as much of the summer as they can on their own initiative. And they'd like really to have that engagement with the department, so that in the context of the national plan for reopening, the department is aware and can factor in the plans which schools may themselves already be making to ensure that they can provide catch-up and support for children, especially the ones that they regard as vulnerable.
So David, if we can pick up on special, lots of special schools, we've had to look very closely in terms of guidance that we've been issuing with them, and we've worked very closely with Public Health England, but also the whole sector, to make sure that, because of the unique nature of support that they're providing, is that we're giving them the best guidance as possible. In terms of return, in terms of these settings, is the knowledge that is contained in these schools of their pupils and their very specific needs is probably the, you know, there is no one that has a better understanding of what that is, and we're looking very closely at how we can support those schools in terms of any return. As you yourself know, many of these schools have continued to operate, and we've been looking at different ways that we can support them to make sure that they continue to support the most vulnerable children in our society, and we'll continue to double up in terms of those efforts when there is a more general return. But we recognise it's going to be very specific advice that's needed for those settings, that is tailored for those settings, that's going to be quite separate from the general return for all of the schools. In terms of work that's been done, the department's engaged in a whole set of stream of works about how we look at helping those children catch up in terms of work that we recognise that they will probably have missed out. And we've already had a lot of engagement with multi-academy trusts and schools as to how best we can assist them in terms of supporting them in doing that. And that will be through a whole range of different activities, a little bit like some of the ones that you've yourself highlighted, but we're hoping to bring forward some of that thinking over the next few weeks and share that with schools and work in conjunction with them. And actually, most of the thinking that we've done is actually borrowing from the knowledge and the expertise of the school sector, who know better than anyone else as to how best to support their pupils in making sure that they're not disadvantaged from the weeks that they've missed in school.
Thank you. David Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. Can you say anything about the measures that you expect the department to use to make sure the disadvantage gap is not growing between the poorest children and the rest as a result of this lockdown?
Well, we've already highlighted the fact that we're sort of rolling out a digital programme. We're going to be coming up with a whole set of other actions to be particularly targeted. I mean, a little bit like the chairman himself was highlighting the fact that there need to be quite specific targeted actions at some of those disadvantaged children. This is very much what we're looking at doing, and looking at developing a whole set of policies that are going to be helping and supporting those children, to be ensuring that they don't fall behind in terms of their studies. But we mustn't forget that actually every child is going to have suffered as a result of not being in school. And we do need to have a whole set of actions that support the whole school population. There's going to be needed a very targeted approach at some of those from the most disadvantaged communities, and how we help them and how we give them that lift. As I say, the digital package, which is a £100 million package, was the first stage of that, but it is the first stage and certainly not the last stage. But I'm not in a position to be able to outline the policies that we're going to be doing, but we are very aware of what needs to be done.
I suppose I was, thank you for that. I suppose I was thinking, what will your indicators be looking at the performance of children to make sure that this is not having an undue impact? So I appreciate there'll be more measures that you take. What indicators are you going to look at?
Sorry, David, I think you raised an important point. In fact, there's actually the assessment programs that we have actually put into schools over the last 10 years are an incredibly important part in making sure that children's attainment is continuously monitored, and actually that we're constantly looking at where they're falling, where if a child is falling behind their sort of year group, and making sure that action is undertaken. We're looking at a whole different range in terms of reading ages to see if there's actually children have been falling behind in terms of their reading age as a result of not being in the school environment. We'll be having to look at a whole set of different baseline assessments to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what children need. I think the teaching profession is acutely aware, and they, of course, hold so much of the expertise in terms of making sure that that assessment of children is made in terms of their return to school and what action is undertaken. But we'll be looking at supporting schools with guidance and advice as to how best to make those assessments, and working with them to make sure the interventions are put in place so that they don't fall behind.
And can I, just as a final point on this, can I encourage the department, if it's not already planning to pay particular attention to the destinations data for these cohorts that will be leaving, to make sure that we're not seeing a radically different set of destinations for these guys that we would usually see?
David, that is such an important point, and it's something that I've been particularly concerned about. And the Department for Education has some of the most developed data in terms of looking at young people's trajectories and where they go in life through the different stages of both education and work of any government department. But I'm particularly concerned about children from those vulnerable groups, because they've been outside of the outside of school or outside of college, that maybe they have not been pushed to seize some of the opportunities that are really open to them and that could be truly transformational in terms of their life. So we're doing a whole body of work about how we reach out to those children, make sure that they understand that these are great opportunities for them, whether that is through further education, college, doing different levels of qualification, or whether that is taking the opportunity to go to university, going to the very best university that we can encourage them to do.
Okay, thank you. Just before I bring in Ian on the free school meals issues, Caroline Johnson, are you there? Can you hear? Because she had a question. I'm just going to read out her question, if I may, Secretary of State. I would like to, she'd like to ask about guidance to schools on provisions for the curriculum, what guidance there are for children with no broadband access. She's suggesting that some children are not on broadband due to geography rather than finance, and these children would not be routinely be disadvantaged, but now are. And how are these children being picked up?
Okay. So, Caroline raises an important point, because there are parts of the country which do suffer from very poor broadband connection. This is why I think our shared passion, Mr. Chairman, to involve the BBC and really support the BBC and the work that it's been doing in terms of providing educational resource through the television is so useful and so important. We've also issued whole sets of guidance for schools and resources that actually, if children are suffering from no proper access to broadband, we'd be really encouraging for them to be able to share with children, to be able to sort of post out to them if they're not able to access broadband, to be able to access education resources. We've also, sorry, Mr. Chairman, but we've also, as part of our digital package, we've recognised a number of people don't have access to 4G. So that was why part of the package, quite a substantial part of the package, was about creation of a, distribution of 4G access for families, so they're able to access internet if they've not previously been able to do so.
Caroline, I think you can hear now. Is that okay? Is that right?
Yes, I can. So my constituency is particularly affected, I think, as a rural constituency by the lack of broadband. And one of the things that what concerned me about our meeting earlier in the week with the lady from OFSTED was that there was no review at all of the provisions that school have been providing during this period. I wondered if how providers varying packages, some of which are. And what guidance is your department giving to schools to support those children who live in rural geographies and don't have access to the broadband? I understand that you've got the BBC, but if somebody has more than one child, just having enough amount of time for the programme to go through the BBC programmes may not be possible. Many parents, many families don't have the opportunity to look at more than one channel at the same time in the house. Can you hear me?
I've heard, Caroline, I've heard elements of it. I think you're demonstrating some of the challenges of poor internet access, sort of very.
Sorry for speaking.
You know, there are challenges. There are geographical challenges where we've been trying to build up quite a substantial resource base for schools in order to be able to access and in terms of guidance. I mean, you know, obviously the internet is the easiest, most cost-effective, and also the most you know, simple way of sharing things most widely. We do recognise that some schools will have sort of technological challenges in terms of being able to do that. That's why you know, most areas of the country do have sort of good 4G connection if they don't necessarily always have the best sort of internet connection. That's why we sort of done the 4G package that we sort of brought forward. But it's really about trying to give schools guidance and advice in terms of actually how they can use resources to sort of send out to sort of children. But we're not at the we're not in a position where we're sort of Ofsted are doing inspections of schools to sort of check as to what they're doing, but we're trying to put as much resource there to be available to schools to give them the best chance of being able to support all communities, wherever they are, whether they're town, city or rural.
Tom, did you have a question?
Sort of a disadvantaged, particularly those, I'm really concerned about those with sort of dyslexia and dyspraxia. I mean, I know that the Oak Academy, you know, it does have support for those with autism and quite severe forms of SEN, but I have had a number of teachers express concerns to me that it's not dyslexia friendly, and or for those with dyspraxia either. I think, as somebody who's got dyslexia and dyspraxia myself, I know actually that IT, online, things that are online, they're not easy for us. We struggle with the processes and it can be really difficult. And often for those who have got dyslexia and dyspraxia, they have very special relationships with certain teachers that they work with on a daily basis. And those relationships are what get them through the challenges and help them progress. So I think that when considering the impact this is having on those who have special educational needs, I would really urge the government to do everything they can to support those with dyslexia and dyspraxia, as well as those with more severe forms of SEND as well.
Tom, as someone who sort of knows some of the challenges that dyslexia brings in terms of learning for young people, I know that this is incredibly important and something that a lot of parents really sort of worry about. We have tried to across the whole sort of spectrum of needs that children have, we've tried to put actually as broad a range of advice and resources available to them. But I do recognise that that there's probably a hunger for ever more support. As you can imagine, in terms of the Oak National Academy, this was a resource that has been born out of sort of a crisis that has been really pulled together at amazing speed by some amazing and wonderful people who've put so much personal effort in terms of making it happen. But we'll certainly be looking at what more that we can do to help and assist those children and those families who are trying to support their children with dyslexia or dyspraxia. I must confess, the best way of supporting them is making sure that actually they're back into a good, safe school setting at the earliest opportunity, and that's why I'm genuinely so passionate to see schools return when it's the right time to do so, because I know that there's so many children, and I think the whole committee's touched on it, children from every single background, every single one of them benefits from being in school and has the best opportunity and the best way, in the best position to be able to learn when they're in school. And that's why I'm so keen to see schools return when it is that right time and when we can make that happen.
Thank you. Did Upsana, did you have a quick question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Secretary of State. Just a quick question about the emerging evidence that it's not just, well, actually that some adults from BAME backgrounds or Black and ethnic minority backgrounds may be disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So what plans are there in place to work with other departments to consider what this means in particular for Black and ethnic minority staff alongside other categories of vulnerable workers that are delivering teaching at the moment?
Absana, the decision to return schools in a phased manner will be a decision that is made right across government in the best interests of the pupils and the teachers, and making sure that this is done in a coordinated manner and working with all government departments to ensure that all considerations are properly taken on board. The issue that you raise is something that is a really important consideration for the SAGE subgroup that we've asked to look at the issues of schools returning and making sure that they're done is done in the best possible and the right way to protect the interests of pupils and protect the interests of those who are working in schools, whether that be teachers or support staff. So this is a key consideration, making sure that we get that right. And we'll always be guided by both the scientific and medical advice to make sure that we make the right decisions.
You just said that the decisions to open schools in a phased manner will be decided by the scientific advice. Does that mean that when it does happen, they will be open in a phased way?
Mr. Chairman, when we bring schools back, which I think everyone wants to see schools returning, they'll be returned in a phased manner, so that we recognise that the idea of schools all returning on day one with a full complement of pupils is not a really practical.
Okay, but you haven't decided the way that phasing is going to work yet, whether it's primary or secondary or early years?
Mr. Chairman, we're working with the sector and with schools to make sure that when we do this, this is a logical and sensible route to doing it. We're looking at many countries across the globe that are a number of weeks ahead of us, you know, whether it's nations such as Germany or Denmark, and looking at what works for them, how we can learn from that best practice. Of course, every nation has a slightly different schooling system, so the lessons that they've sort of learned don't always translate, but it's important to look at what.
Thank you. I'll do a quick question from Christian, and then Ian, I promise I'll bring you in now for this other stuff. Thank you for being patient. Christian.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary of State, for joining us today. Similar to the question that Tom was going on earlier, last week I met with Bury Together, which was a group of parents with SEND children. So I'm just wondering what engagement the department is making with parent carer forums during the lockdown to make sure that the right information is getting to parents to how they can educate their children during the lockdown in the absence of being able to engage fully with the Oak Academy. And on a similar point, obviously the Oak Academy, as a great resource it is, unfortunately there's still no real resource to help parents with early years children, myself included. So whilst it is very nice to have the toddler at home, it's very difficult to know what best to actually do to actually help educate them. And if we get early years wrong, that potentially sets a child's educational career up for the absolute wrong trajectory. So what's the department doing for early years in lockdown to make sure that actually our younger children are benefiting the most?
Yeah. So we're looking, obviously, some of the key priorities have been children in years 10 and 12, as the committee will appreciate that we've recognised that there's been, those are the children who are going to be facing exams at the earliest stage. So quite understandably, a lot of focus has been put in terms of supporting them. Oak National Academy has been touching across every single year group, but we have been trying to work with, one of the best resources in terms of access, again, has been the BBC in terms of touching some of those sort of early years. But we do recognise that there's always a demand for more. I take on board your point that you would like to see more in early years. I will try and make sure that we have a specially targeted package for you, Christian, to be able to educate your children. But we're constantly working with the sector to sort of actually develop the offer that we've got. As you've probably seen from the gov.uk website, we put up an enormous amount of resource, whether it is for children who have got special educational needs, whether it is children of all age groups. And it isn't just about the Oak National Academy. There's a whole set of players, businesses, organisations that have made their resources free. And we've tried to use the gov.uk website as the opportunity to signpost, whether it's parents or whether it's teachers, to these resources of every single age group, but also of every single ability range, making sure that we've got the very highest quality resources.
Thank you. Ian has been waiting for a long time, so thank you so much. There were so many questions on that from members.
Yeah, it's returning to the issue of what are we doing to ensure the disadvantaged youngsters are being catered for in this period. And of course, one of the things which has been done is the development of a voucher system to make sure that youngsters have access to enough food for when they should have been at school and would have got a free school meal. But it has to be said, Secretary of State, I could probably talk to you for the next 45 minutes, which I won't be allowed to, about the failings of the Edenred system and the inordinate amount of time it's taking school staff, in particular head teachers, out of hours to access the system, hours and hours on end. And I've been kind of collecting horror stories really about the Edenred system from head teachers and how inaccessible the whole system actually is to them. And the fact that it's taking hours and hours, the head teachers have learned that Edenred themselves have stated that the number of youngsters that they were expected to cater for was originally 100% understated by the DFE, and therefore they weren't actually geared up for the numbers that they eventually then had to deal with. And I've seen head teachers have described to me that if they had to put on a bar graph their interaction with the Edenred system, it would go something from the low end, deep frustration, to the high end, please kill me now, because it is taking so long to interact with this system. Secretary of State, what can be done? Because as a result of this, many youngsters who should be getting this support are still struggling to get that support. And we've also had a situation where free school meal services provided by the local authority have jumped back into the void and provide hundreds upon hundreds of meals for youngsters in a packed lunch format.
So Ian, right from the start, we're very keen for schools to be able to continue to provide funding, school meals in terms of at a local level. And obviously the funding for school meals that can be provided by schools has continued all the way through this period. Additional to that, we wanted to be able to give schools the ability to offer additional resources, because we recognise that all children who would be eligible for free schools meals wouldn't be able to necessarily access schools themselves in order to be able to have the benefit of the meal that we'd already funded and provided through that school to be able to do. So additional to that, we wanted to be able to put in resource. We did say to schools that we'd give them the flexibility to be able to procure it locally up to the value of £15, and we increased the amount that we're willing to be able to spend on that. But we did also say, in terms of the Edenred system, we wanted to put something in place which was a national voucher scheme, that if it wasn't to be able to be provided locally, or there wasn't the systems in place, this is something that they could turn to. I readily acknowledge that actually the level of demand for this has been exceptionally high, and we've had some big challenges in terms of being able to provide schools with the level of service that we would have really wanted them to see. But we've been putting, both from the department's point of view and with Edenred, doing everything we can do to support them in terms of being able to get these vouchers out as rapidly as possible. We, in the first few weeks, we saw a very slow turnaround in terms of people getting the vouchers out. That's increased substantially. We still have some challenges in terms of actually schools being able to access as rapidly, being able to place those orders. And we're actually sort of doing a lot more work with Edenred to sort of speed that up, because we recognise how important that is.
Ian.
Secretary of State, thank you for that. I mean, I hope that you have gained from my question the deep level of frustration which exists out there. Additionally, though, I understand that a number of the supermarket chains are where people are able to redeem their vouchers, but not the co-op. And there are an awful lot of communities around the country where the co-op might be the only store which is accessible locally. And, you know, I've got no axe to grind with the co-op, but it has been raised with me directly that why isn't the co-op involved in this scheme, given that in many communities it might be the only store which is of any use in terms of redeeming such a voucher. They are ready and willing to participate should the DFE and the Edenred scheme be able to do that for them. So could we see some movement on that, please?
So Ian, we want to have a larger range of supermarkets participating in the scheme, and as of today, McColl's are coming onto the scheme. We saw just a few days ago Aldi coming onto the scheme. We really want the co-op to participate in this scheme, but as you well know, as I do, the co-op isn't one organisation, it's a multitude of different companies, of cooperatives that sort of form it, but obviously operating under one brand. And if I think about where I live, there's 2 co-op stores where I live, both operated by 2 different cooperative societies. And some of the cooperative societies are in a position where they could accept vouchers, but a large number of cooperative societies aren't yet in a position where they can accept the vouchers. So then there is a danger that people are in the confusion if they're going to a co-op store, which is branded exactly the same, but they're not able to access it because that is a cooperative society that isn't able to accept the vouchers. We're working with the cooperative movement to be in a position where they can accept the vouchers. I want nothing more to do this. It was one of the supermarket organisations right at the start. We wanted to get them on board. I know that they want to do so, and they're working really hard with all of their members to be in a position to be able to accept those vouchers, but avoiding the confusion for people who may potentially go into a co-op that wouldn't then be able to accept that voucher. But we're trying to get there. And if there's anything that you or the committee can do in terms of working with the cooperative movement to help them to get into that position, we're doing everything we can to help, and we'd hope that we're in a position where we can get them accepting these.
I'm going to bring in Fleur and then Jonathan briefly on this. Fleur.
Thank you. Jonathan's going to ask, I think, about the Wandy scheme, but I would just like to ask why Edenred was chosen when it didn't and still doesn't, from what you're saying, enable cooperation with Lidl or the co-op, but it does with Waitrose and M&S. And given the group of people who we are working to provide the free school meals, it doesn't seem to have been the right choice of a company to have supported from the start. And I'd like to echo what Ian was saying about the co-op, that they do want to work with the department on this. They are ready and willing, but they cannot work with Edenred. They've gone as far as they can for that. So there needs to be some flexibility and different ways of working, which I'm sure can be done, but just needs to go outside the Edenred scheme, which many schools have had to do in order to get those free school meal vouchers early enough as well, because they've taken a long time to come.
If you could try and give a brief answer, Secretary of State, thank you.
So the reason that Edenred was chosen, as you would imagine, you would very much hope for me to always operate within the law, and in terms of procurement of making the commercial procurement decisions, Edenred was already an approved supplier that we're able to turn to at speed. You raise a particular point about actually schools do have a flexibility. We wanted to build in the flexibility. So if, for example, a school is serving a community where the only store is a cooperative, they actually have the ability, and they'll be fully reimbursed and fully refunded in order to be able to procure vouchers from that cooperative in order to distribute to that local community, because we recognise immediately from the start that, you know, the speed that we were creating a system, we could not create a perfect system. So we recognised we needed to give schools the flexibility to do that. And that's why they have a flexibility. So if they need to work with a cooperative and want to work with a cooperative in that way, they can procure vouchers and do it in that manner. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, obviously I appreciate what you're saying, you know, with regards to Edenred obviously being selected due to your constraints within the law, but we are in unprecedented times, and I do applaud the DFE on, you know, trying to pull off what is, you know, hopefully a once in a lifetime thing with this. But can I ask Wandy, who already provides to 16,000 schools vouchers, why would they be ignored when they offered their assistance with the delivery of this voucher scheme?
If I can write to you, Jonathan, in terms of the details of the decisions that we made in terms of the procurement, I'd be very happy to write to you directly with the details as to how we reached that decision and at the speed that we had to sort of make that.
Appreciate that, thank you.
I think the general point of the committee is it's great and amazing that you've been able to set this up in a record time, but there are one school after another is having huge difficulties getting access to it, and queues online. It's a bit like trying to get a supermarket delivery, but obviously this is for vulnerable children. So I think that's kind of underlying the questions of the committee.
I think, Mr. Chairman, effectively we had to sort of create a whole new strand of sort of almost support for families that had previously never been done by a department at such speed, to such an extent before. And we recognise that there have been real challenges with the system, and we really do value the patience that people have shown. But please let me reassure the committee that we're doing everything we can do in terms of both putting flexibility in the system for schools to work to local need, but also equally importantly to make sure that this system works as best as possible for those schools and those parents who are accessing it.
David Johnson, do you want to come in any more on online learning? Or
there was just one small question. Am I right, Secretary of State, it's 200,000 laptops that you expect to supply? Is that what you said earlier? Yes. In your guidance, it says that the devices will go to some Year 10 pupils. Does that include free school meal eligible pupils?
It's going to be, we're going to be giving schools the opportunity to decide as to where the resource is best needed. Obviously, if a child already has access to IT equipment, we think it would be logical for, there's not really an awful lot of point in sort of doubling up in terms of that resource. Free school meals is one of those factors, but we think that schools will be the best people to use sensible discretion, because we want this resource to be as widely used for children who have the greatest need. And there's a lot of children who obviously have access who are on free school meals, but will have access to laptops. So we wouldn't want to see doubling up.
Thank you. Just on the online learning, I know we've talked a lot about this, but given the importance of early years in setting up children to learn, do you have any plans to increase access to online learning for very younger children at home?
No, not currently in sort of specific sort of department-led online sort of portal, not in the sort of the realm of where the National Academy was, but we're currently across a whole set of areas. We're sort of so rapidly developing different offers, and if you'd asked me 4 months ago as to whether we would have the Oak National Academy running, I would have not believed that that was possible. So as to where we'll be in a month's time, I imagine we'll be in a substantially different place than we are today.
I think there is significant recognition. There are some remarkable things that have been done, and the Oak National Academy, the laptops for older children for the year 10s. It's just the concern, you don't need to answer this, but the concern that there are still a lot of people who are not online, who are disadvantaged, who may not be getting the education they need, or don't have access to online learning. And I appreciate you can't solve every problem at once, but we're raising it because it is potentially a serious issue.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could signpost, and maybe this would be a good one to signpost Christian to as well. This isn't something that we developed during the coronavirus crisis, but the development of a Hungry Little Minds project, which I'm sure that the Select Committee is familiar with, is an amazing resource that's very much targeted at those early years. And while it wasn't developed in response to coronavirus, it does actually have a lot of value in terms of actually supporting those early years, especially in terms of language development. And I know that members of the committee are very conscious that language development is one of those key determinants as to how well a child does in terms of later life. So we'd be very keen to get parents and youngsters sort of accessing those resources that have already been created, recognising the importance of the early years environment.
I'm going to bring in Jonathan Gullis now, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. With regards to, obviously with the exams, can I ask what conversation has the department, or is the department having with Ofqual to ensure all exam candidates receive a fair grade? And how accessible will the appeals and resit process be in terms of administrative burden and cost?
So as part of engagement with stakeholders, we have a round table, and Ofqual are one of those key members of that round table every single week. And we've worked incredibly closely with Ofqual. And if I could just thank them and the exam boards for the work that they've done in terms of working closely with the sector to try and actually create a system that is fair and has been in response to this crisis. You know, the Ofqual have launched a major consultation, and it's obviously had a very high response. That's a consultation that closes today, and we're very keen to make sure that people's input in terms of concerns that they may have in terms of the process that Ofqual have outlined is properly listened to, and we will respond to those concerns. So it would be, I don't want to preempt the consultation, but we will listen very, very closely to those concerns that schools, parents and other organisations have raised as in response to this. For me, the best form of assessment is an exam, and any other form of assessment is not going to be as good as a proper exam serial. So, but that wasn't an option that was going to be open to me. And can you imagine the amount of uncertainty and the amount of worry that so many children would be having at the moment, and teachers and all those who are working in schools would be having if we hadn't outlined what we were going to do and recognising the fact that we weren't going to be able to run an exam series. That's why we did what we...
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add one thing in terms of...
Very briefly, because we've got a fair few questions to go through.
But I particularly wanted children, if they did not think that the grade was a true and fair reflection on the work or what they would able to achieve, to have the opportunity to sit an exam. And that's why we've been working with Ofqual and the exam boards to provide an autumn serial of exams. Because I think that if people do not feel as if this is the right qualification that they truly deserve, the best way is giving them the opportunity to sit a shortened exam paper and have the opportunity to sit that exam and get the grade that they truly believe is what they can achieve.
Jonathan, you've got to come back to that.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll put the two questions together in order of speeding up time. Obviously, Secretary of State, I appreciate that, you know, collecting data before the 20th of March is extremely stressful, because as a former teacher, as you've alluded to, I know that with mock exams, for example, you would have set very challenging papers and probably marked harsher as a way of motivating students. And I do fear the impact that will have, especially on disadvantaged, because obviously it won't necessarily be a true and fair reflection. I will just come to my two questions though. One is obviously the transitions phase, especially in the primary sector. Those currently in year 5 who are due to sit their SATs at the end of Key Stage 2 in the 2020-2021 academic year, what preparation is being done for them, and also to come to the idea of how we work out these grades, because the Fisher Family Trust, you know, was set up in order to help with target setting, but has said that these are estimates in their own words. And I wonder if we'll be looking at how we use Fisher Family Trust in the future when it comes to target grades.
So, Jonathan, in terms of exams, as I said, are the best form of assessment that we can possibly have. But we have particularly asked Ofqual and the exam boards to look at the issues in terms of disadvantaged pupils as they're approaching, in terms of approaching assessment, and BAME communities as well, as there's been some particular concern that they may be disadvantaged as a result of the process. So we asked Ofqual, we asked the exam board to consider that as part of the work that they're doing, and in terms of a solution that they're providing in terms of the creation, you know, the awarding of grades to pupils. We'd certainly be, we're working with a whole range of organisations, and the reason that we're consulting on this is just making sure that whether it's the Fisher Foundation or others who have got really valuable advice and guidance in terms of how we can do this, we can take that on board in terms of how we take this forward. But what is so important is, you know, we've got a number of transition years, and I want to be getting back to a position where we're doing proper assessments, whether that's through you know, through examinations as rapidly as possible. And you highlight years 5. You also highlight really years 10 and 12. Those years that are going to be facing exams. How we can make sure that we're supporting them so they're in best position to be able to deal with those exams and actually succeed in those exams, because I am absolutely adamant that we do not want to be disadvantaging those children as a result of this crisis, and how we put those interventions to help them to make sure that they succeed, and that gives them the gateway to succeed in so many other things in life, is absolutely pivotal to everything the department's doing.
Thank you. Apsana was waiting for a question. And then I'll bring in David Johnson briefly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. You mentioned about the impact of grading and assessments on particular communities, and I just want to ask for a bit more detail in that area as to what plans you have what plans and what consultation you're doing with stakeholders and organisations to ensure that there isn't an unconscious bias and that's reduced and mitigated in assessments.
Well, Absana, right at the start of the process, we highlighted this as a particular area of concern, and we didn't want in everything that Ofqual did in terms of creation of a system of the awarding of grades, they had to be conscious of the fact that there was evidence that a number of youngsters within those communities were in danger of sort of not realising the grade that they would have been sort of achieving if there'd been a traditional exam. So that's why that they've come up with the system that they have. The ability to have a say on this is why they've done the consultation, which is closing today. And I would hope that those communities and organisations that sort of specialising in this area are using the opportunity of consultation to making their voice heard, so that Ofqual and the exam boards can properly take on board those concerns in terms of what they do and make sure mitigation is put in place to make sure that no one is disadvantaged.
David, just Johnson, before I bring you in, I've got another question from Caroline Johnson, who has trouble connecting. She asks, on her behalf, in terms of nurseries and childminders, what thoughts that you have on how and when they may be able to reopen?
Well, this would be very much in line in terms of the actions that we take across the whole school and college estate, and it would be considered within the round of that assessment, and we'd be looking at SAGE to give us the very best advice to make sure that any moves in terms of whether it's bringing nurseries, schools or colleges back are done to ensure that it's in line with our efforts.
Thank you. David Johnston, thank you.
Just very quickly, I've had constituents who homeschool their children write to me and quite rightly say that their assessments will not be allowed to form the grades that their children get. So they really need those autumn exams. I know you don't want to preempt the consultation, but it'd be good if you could push for those exams in the autumn to be as early as possible, because that's a group that will really need those.
David, you and I are thinking in very much the sort of same space in terms of these exams. I would want, we've got to work with schools to make sure that, and those who are sort of have the ability to be able to put them into action, but I would like to see them at the very earliest stage. But we do have practical considerations to consider, but this is why having an autumn serial is incredibly important, and why we sort of pushed for it.
Thank you. Ian, you've got a question, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, moving on to the question of independent training providers. Why didn't the department immediately comply with the Cabinet Office guidance and announce support for providers with a contract, those providers who have a contract with the Education, Skills and Funding Agency? Why wasn't that support package automatically done?
Well, we always comply with a Cabinet Office guidance, and we always will do.
Well, the implication is that the department hasn't done so on this occasion. So I would ask you to look at that, Secretary of State, please. And what are you doing to safeguard the apprenticeship and skills sector in particular?
Well, Ian, it's a very important point, and we've got to be looking, and I'm sure well, obviously the Select Committee is already looking at this, the most important part is now starting to looking at the recovery of this, and I see apprenticeships playing a really important role as part of that. We've taken a whole number of actions in terms of increasing the flexibility so people can continue their apprenticeships, and over 81% of apprenticeships are continuing as we speak. but obviously that means that 19% of apprenticeships aren't. And what we've been looking through the ESFA is how we support some of those apprenticeship providers who aren't able to continue to deliver apprenticeships either through online learning or being able to sort of access those apprentices, but in those critical areas of where we're needing to preserve that high quality, of how we can put a package there to support those providers and make sure that we have a sustainable future in apprenticeships. I really think that there is an opportunity for us as we come out of this to make sure that we really skill our workforce in a way in terms of dealing with a new economy that's going to emerge, some of the newer opportunities that we are going to be facing, but also some of the new challenges we have. And we've recently launched the digital toolkit, skills toolkit, which is specialising in digital resources. We want to be looking at different ways we can do that, but apprenticeships is a key part of that.
Can I just come in on the skills kit, which it looks like a credible option for people to reskill. Can I just confirm is it new online learning, or are you redirecting people to existing things that are online?
Well, we've worked very closely with providers to actually look at what was some of the high quality resources that were there, and we've corralled them together. What I was hoped to do is to see this as a platform of something that we can grow and actually put, as we develop new qualifications or new modules that actually can be added there for people to access, is be a platform that become larger over time and actually offering a much wider range of resources for there. So it is existing resources that we pull together, but I'd like...
And is the National Retraining Scheme, is that still the 100 million, is that been transmogrified into the National Skills Fund, or is it a separate fund? And if so, could some of that 100 million be used to help fund sort of these reskilling online courses for lifetime learning and people who are working but are not able to at the moment?
Mr. Chairman, it's separate from the National Skills Fund, and yes, you're absolutely right, and that's exactly what we're looking at, is how we can use the retraining scheme as part of our response to the coronavirus.
So you could use some of those funds to support reskilling. Great. Ian, sorry, you got a quick one?
Yeah, it's just to come back, Secretary of State. I've got a constituent called Alice who attends or has been attending Newcastle College, but our course has been curtailed, and she's asking, why is it that A-level students will get a predicted grade based on assessment, but her as a BTEC student understands that she won't get a predicted grade, and she's really concerned about what's going to happen because she's been unable to finish the course at the moment, and she's hoping to do a nursing degree course at Sunderland University. Could you have a look at that, Secretary of State, if there is, one rule for one and one rule for another?
So, Ian, if you'd be kind enough maybe to forward the details of a particular qualification that Alice is looking at. We're very keen to give the predicted, the assessed grades, and not for A-levels, but for BTECs as well. And that is largely what's being done. We do have a issue where there is, on a number of courses, and it isn't the overall, it's a minority of courses, where there has to be some on-the-job assessment in order for them to be able to complete it. And we're working with the sector to make sure that we're able to complete that final element of assessment, which just because you can't do, you've got to show a competency, a practical competency in order to be able to complete it. But we treated BTECs in exactly the same way as we have treated A-levels, but it is that competency element in terms of practical demonstration that holds us back in a number of areas, and working to make sure Alice and many others are able to complete that at the earliest stage so they can get the qualification they've worked so hard for is incredibly important to, I know, you and me.
Before I bring in Fleur, I'm just going to bring in Tom, who wants to go back to a couple of issues. Tom.
Hi, just a couple of questions. So I did actually engage with a lot of my constituents before this meeting, and a common theme that came up and is raised by a number of different people was the issue of those in reception, so ages 4 and 5, and how important that first year is, and how so much of it is about relationships, and it's so important to be at class for that formative year. So just an idea about what specific plans there are by the government to address any concerns there. I mean, I know lots of parents might want their children to repeat that year, and I think if there was a case for summer schooling, it absolutely could well be appropriate for them. And also another question with regards to the national review on SEND that the Department of Education are carrying out at the moment. Just any idea about timescales and who the department have been talking to on that review. I mean, earlier this week, when we spoke to the Chief Inspector of OFSTED, I was slightly concerned when I found out that under the new framework, it might still be possible for a school to be awarded good or outstanding, even if there are serious deficiencies with regards to provision for those with special educational needs. Sorry, that's quite a few questions there. Sorry about that.
So in terms of reception, I totally agree about the important role that reception plays, I think all families are feeling a great amount of pressure with having sort of children at home. In terms of how we bring schools back, again, it's got to be looked at totally within the round, but we do recognise the important role that reception has in terms of that early development of a child, and how we sort of support parents to provide home resources for their children at this critical stage, and we'll continue to do that. The SEND review is something that we are continuing to do work on. We recognise it's important. To say that coronavirus hasn't had an impact in terms of how we've had to, deal with that, it will have delayed when the SEND review can report back, but work is still ongoing because we feel the importance of getting special educational needs provision right is so critical in terms of getting the whole schooling system right. And that's something that is felt right across government. But as you can imagine, a key part of special educational needs is also, and if we think about education and healthcare plans, a key element of that is also the health element. And as you can understand, there are multiple pressures within the Department of Health at the moment. So we do need to make sure that we don't we don't bring the SEND review to a halt when we don't make sure it's a complete picture and it's a complete result to what we want to do with the special educational needs system.
Thank you, Fleur.
Thank you. I'd like to jump from early years to the higher education sector. And ask a couple of questions about the future for funding and for stability of admissions as well. My local Vice-Chancellor in my university says that there is a very significant risk to our financial stability. And I know that universities are extremely worried about their future, and have produced the paper Achieving Stability in the Higher Education Sector. So first of all, on international students and that part of the picture, what assessment have you made about the future and the impact of COVID-19 on the international student recruitment? Of international students specifically, and also of European Union students who are going to face potentially immigration status changes, and what flexibilities will you be introducing to help lessen this impact?
So thank you ever so much, Fleur. And you raised an important point in terms of the international student market. We've actually, as a department, along with Universities UK and obviously the Office for Budget Responsibility, have been doing quite a considerable amount of work in terms of looking at the impacts in terms of the education sector. Universities UK have done a lot of analysis as to the potential impact in terms of university finances, and this has been done very closely in terms of Department for Education and how we respond to this. The impact on international students is part of this is going to be when we're coming out of the measures that we've had to impose, but also many others have had to impose. And at the moment, I'm not in a position to say when that's going to be. And so we can't put a definitive number as to what impact universities feel. But we are working closely with the university sector in terms of actually, and also the Home Office, to look at the flexibilities that we can introduce, recognising that people will have difficulty taking English language courses in order to be able to then access university. And we've worked closely with the Home Office to put those flexibilities in so that universities are still able to continue their international recruitment, so that they can be in a place where they're welcoming international students into the new academic year. We're also working more broadly with the sector in terms of a package of measures to bring stability to the system.
Thank you. You mentioned the package of measures, and Universities UK have asked for substantial funding for research funding and stability in student application measures. There is some speculation that there is a delay or a block on this university bailout because an admissions free-for-all or a Wild West kind of situation, there'll be quite a change in where students apply to, would leave some universities more exposed financially than others. And then you or the Treasury are able to pick and choose who are saved rather than saving the sector in a more strategic way. Could you comment on that speculation?
I think for me, the main concern in terms of universities is for students that are actually in the universities and making sure that they have the stability to finish their either undergraduate or postgraduate degree. We then also need to make sure that we're safeguarding the amazing research resource that universities have and the important role that they play in terms of our nation in making sure that we're at the forefront of science and technology. And finally, and it's an incredibly important point, is that making sure that we recognise the important role that universities play to the economy of their local communities. And we're wanting to preserve stability for the whole sector, and that's why we've been working closely with Universities UK to ensure that we can deliver that. But those are the three aims of what we're working towards to bring that stability. But we mustn't forget, yes, it's about the stability of the institutions, but it's about those students that are studying there and making sure that they have the confidence and the belief that we're supporting them to make sure that they realise their aspirations in terms of getting their degree.
So when will you be likely to be announcing some of these measures and stability measures?
Well, we're working with the sector in terms of actually pulling a package together, and we're hoping to do so in the near future.
Thank you, David. You've got a quick question on this, David Johnston.
Yes, I appreciate the pressure the HE providers are under, but my question is about the students of HE, because there was a good case that some of them weren't getting a lot of contact time to begin with. Some of them have suffered from the strike. They've now got a lockdown where they're not getting teaching, and they're also being hammered by accommodation costs, particularly if they rented private accommodation. And I wondered what your message was to the students of HE about how the DfE is thinking about them.
So there's, for me, there's a very clear guidance that actually, if universities, if they're wishing to get tuition fees, have to provide learning, education, and assessment to those students who are paying through student loans in order to be able to access higher education. And that is what's to be expected, and universities have to be doing that in order to be able to claim the fees that students are paying.
Thank you. Have you finished with that? A question, Flo, very quickly, because we're rushing along a bit.
My final question, and obviously we'll have to wait to see the package of measures to be able to assess them as a committee, but thank you for that. My final question is about the mental health of students. Do you have an assessment of there are, and we have indications that there are increasing mental health needs of students who are either locked down away from home or at home but have less support? Do you have an assessment of the increase of mental health needs so that you can put in measures to accommodate them?
I think this applies across the board in terms of children at home as well, younger children, the increase in mental health issues.
We've been doing that assessment, and we've been looking at different ways that we can support both children at universities and across the spectrum in terms of dealing with some of those mental health issues that they may be facing.
Christian.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, the Secretary of State has mentioned several times about the strategy for reopening schools, and that will follow the advice of SAGE. However, I was just wondering to what extent you're actually consulting those education bodies as to how that's going to look like, or if they're able to feed into that conversation. So I know when I've spoken to several of my schools and also the nurseries and childcare providers, they've said at the moment they've not been consulted on anything, and actually they'd like to take part in that, so they can advise how that would be best represented by them rather than straight down from government to the education body.
So Christian, I'm sure you'll appreciate, with over sort of 22,000 schools and nurseries, I think if it's not really feasible for us to run a consultation with every single organisation right across the country, but the department's been, I myself have been holding regular meetings with the sector and with organisations that represent a whole spectrum of both schools, but also unions as well. And the department's been holding direct talks with different organisations. We pulled together a sector body which is having regular discussions as to the best ways moving forward. But it's just not going to be feasible to have a UK-wide consultation for people to be able to sort of feed into. What people will want is a clarity and a certainty as to how schools, how nurseries are going to be reopened. But in terms of actually listening to what the sector is saying, we're doing that, and we're doing it absolutely hand in glove in terms of our discussions that we'll continue to hold as to how that is best done.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I guess a kind of follow-up question to that, although slightly more generic, would be, what do you think the department can actually learn from this whole situation of COVID-19? So what's gone well, what's not gone well, and what are the lessons we're actually moving forward with?
So I think there's a whole host of different areas that we can actually learn and benefit from. I think the ability to support children within the home and through holidays has really been transformed by a lot of the learning that we've had in terms of delivering, in terms of home education, and in terms of support that we can give children. We've actually recognised that resources can be much more rapidly shared, and I would actually hope that we can take we're going to be taking a look at how we can use some of the resources that have been shared and actually sort of reducing teacher workload in terms of lesson planning, in terms of resource sharing, making sure that teachers are getting the very best practice and actually being able to use it and bring it to their classroom. I think there's really sort of EHCP plans and tribunals. Actually, by moving them online, we're actually getting through the backlog of tribunal appeals much more rapidly by being online than they're not by actually being there in person. Can this be something that we learn from and actually start to looking at how we can implement it? But I've said a whole strand of work in terms of looking at recovery, because so often there's so many things that we want to do in education, but we don't do because of the disruption that it may be causing to the sector. And as part of the work that we've initiated is what lessons can we learn in terms of good things that have come out of this crisis that has meant that we can do things better, but also different things that we may want to change in our education system, as in previous times we've always said we won't do because of disruptive effect it has to education.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that, Christian?
A quick follow-up, which is more on the resilience point of view, but that's more relating to virtual schools and EHC plans. So obviously speaking to a number of parents with children with EHC plans, they've said they've put forward some suggestions for spending in regards to those plans that they feel would benefit their children most, but have been turned down by the local authority. So to what aspect is that being considered by the DfE, so that actually the children are learning as much as they can at home, as their parents would see so? And in regards to virtual schools, obviously children looked after are arguably our most vulnerable children. So what work is being done with virtual schools to make sure that the CLAs are actually the ones who are maintaining their schools as much as possible, so that they aren't missing out and having the double whammy of essentially being vulnerable and missing education at the same time?
Well, this is why we particularly targeted that cohort in terms of a sort of digital package that we're rolling out. In terms of parents who think that their children who have an EHCP plan would benefit through a sort of a reworking of that sort of EHC plan, we would really encourage local authorities to sort of demonstrate as much flexibility as possible in terms of actually changing and adapting the way that they allow people to access learning. Because we don't want people to be in that position where they're overly sort of falling further behind as a result of this crisis.
Thank you, David Simmons.
BR have published something to the effect that they think the impact of COVID-19 could have a devastating effect on the education sector. I know we're all very conscious that schools, in some cases, were in a parlous financial position in the run-up to the crisis. Other schools, speaking with some in my constituency, may have many millions of pounds of balances in the bank and are therefore well positioned to cope with it. I'm just interested in the assessment the department's doing about those risks and what steps you think the department might need to take to guard against a financially devastating impact on some schools as a consequence of the pandemic.
Well, we were distinctly conscious of the fact that the sort of change in terms of how schools are running and just being open to critical workers and those vulnerable children may have a impact in terms of school finances. That's why we put in place funds for schools to be able to apply up to £75,000 worth of resources to be able to cover costs that they may incur. We've as yet had no indication that schools are facing a negative impact in the way that you would maybe be concerned about. And I think that's partly down to the fact that we've put in place provision for whether it's primary schools or secondary schools, support there that they're able to call on if there are those abnormal costs that they would maybe be incurring. But we've not had those reports that schools are facing that financial dilemma as a result of that coronavirus crisis. But I'd hope that that has been helped and supported by the actions that we've undertaken right at the start.
Any more, David, at all?
No, that's helpful. I think the key question is going to be, as the OBR flesh out what they mean by that impact, that the department is able to respond to that. And clearly, the significant levels of balances held by some schools are an important part of that. But some of the other providers, including amongst the skills sector, will also be impacted. So I think just making sure that that's monitored for that impact as it plays out.
David, I think you're right to highlight some sort of differing sectors as to how they'll be impacted differently. And yeah, you see the HE sector, the FE sector, the broader skills sector, and also the early years sector, they'll have a different type of impact as a result of this crisis than you'll see in terms of a broad primary and secondary school sector. And we're working very closely, as we've indicated, to make sure that we take early action to help support them in the best ways that we can.
Thank you. Ian's got a quick question before I come on to you, Apsana.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And just following up from David's question and the point that he's raised about school balances, and of course, I thought it would be important to make the point that overall the levels of school balances have diminished, and it's not a uniform or universal issue across all of the school estate. There will be many schools out there who may be watching this morning on Parliament TV who would not recognise the question of there being healthy school balances that they have got to call on in such a drastic situation as we are in at the moment.
Ian, this is why we put in place the action to make sure there was a fund available for schools to be able to call on if they'd incurred expenses as a result of dealing with this crisis.
Fleur.
Thank you. Just to follow up on this, in terms of nursery funding and private nurseries, many nurseries have been in contact with me saying they're in financial difficulties, and this won't be an education funding. This will be you in conversation with the Treasury about how to treat them as small businesses that are in trouble, but that we don't want to lose a lot of our early years sector through falling through the gaps in the Treasury scheme. They especially many felt that they would get the education funding, the early years special funding, as well as being able to furlough staff, and they've been told that they can't. This seems to be a change in the rules. So is there conversations with the Treasury about, and do you know how many nurseries are in potential trouble and could be closing?
So right from the start of this crisis, we put in measures to support the early years provision, and we've seen the fact that we continue to pay the grants to local authorities for those to be sort of passported through to early years providers. But on top of that, you've got the furlough scheme, as well as a whole raft of extra provisions that the Treasury have provided in terms of supporting many small businesses, as well as many larger businesses as well. And of course, you do have a number of large chains that also provide early years provision. We're actually working very closely with early years providers to have an understanding of where some of the weaknesses are in the sector. But we've always been clear, you can't, and the Treasury was clear from the start of launching the furlough scheme, is that you can't actually be getting government grant and then also getting an additional payment on top of that for money that's sort of covering those staff. And I think most people would recognise that we do have a duty and responsibility in terms of payment of public money, and we can't be in a situation of paying for two things twice. But we continue to work with Treasury, but also most importantly continue to work with early years providers to make sure we do everything we can do to support them, as well as with local government, in terms of preserving this really critically important sector that I think everyone wants to see back up and running at the earliest and opportunity and at the right time, as so many parents depend on it.
Can I just ask you very briefly, the Department for Education apparently has not clarified yet whether or not nursing students who work for the NHS during the pandemic are still paying tuition fees. Are they paying tuition fees? And if they are, can you make sure that they're not paying for tuition for that they're not receiving?
I will come back to you on that point, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Apsana.
Thank you, Chair. Moving now on to technical and post-18 education. Given the concerns raised and voiced by, among others, awarding bodies for T-levels, why is the department now pressing ahead with the introduction of T-levels?
Well, as you'll probably remember, Apsana, that this was a programme that had absolute cross-party support with both the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats all supporting the introduction of T-levels. We are proposing to bring forward 3 T-level qualifications across 55 providers across the United Kingdom. We think this, I personally think the introduction of T-levels and actually raising the status of technical and vocational qualifications is one of the most important tasks that this government has. And I'm very keen to make sure that we continue with this programme. And we've been working really closely with that sort of a small number of providers. And we think that we can, as we roll this programme out, we reckon that there's we can learn a lot by the experience of doing it, but we also want to create the opportunity for young people to benefit from this really brilliant qualification that I think, you know, as the equivalent of an A-level, with the status of an A-level, that's going to have a really transformational impact. And you know, for me, technical and vocational qualifications are such an important part, and I know that this is something that has had cross-party support in terms of the importance of this. And, you know, I want to see it happen, and I want to make it to happen. I don't want to see children and youngsters missing out on the opportunity of having that choice.
Apsana.
The Augar review was published last May, and I appreciate that definitely there is a disruption to the government's response. But can you explain what's been done with its proposals since the publication in May last year?
Of course, we're obviously we've been planning to publish our review, our response to the Augar review around the period of a spending review coming out, which was expected to be around the July time of this year. That looks as if that has been pushed back. That has been pushed back, so we'll be still looking at doing a response in line with the spending review. We've done a considerable amount of work, and we've recently set up a white paper task force with Keith Smith from the department leading it in terms of further education. That will be one of the key elements in terms of and key planks of our response to the Augar review. Keith has been doing an immense amount of work, and as I say, we'll be responding to Augar in line with the spending review. But there's an awful lot of work that's going on. Keith's leading this work on the FE white paper, and it's an area of department's work that I think it could be, you know, really revolutionary in terms of driving reform in this vital sector, and incredibly vital for those youngsters.
Thank you. Could I just, I mean, there are some private schools that are behaving very responsibly and trying to work to support students and state schools. But I've had a note that there are some independent schools that are billing parents for as much as £8,000, including a discount for just 2 weeks of online A-level tuition amid school closures. And for children to be given A-level grade recommendations, the pupils must be on the school register. To be on the school's register, the parents must pay the fees. It's a catch-22. So what steps are the government taking to ensure that kind of bad practice doesn't occur, and that independent schools don't use this to capitalise on changes to exam grading in this way, whilst learning doesn't take place the state sector, those schools, and help teach the left behind pupils?
Robert, Mr. Chairman, I do apologise. I lost you as part of that. But in terms of private schools, obviously the department doesn't have any role in terms of the contractual agreements that they have between themselves and parents. But obviously we'd ask everyone to act in the most considerate and sensible and responsible of ways. And I know that right across the whole education system, everyone is in a rapid development and ensuring that they're delivering teaching for every child. And I'm particularly proud of the work that's been done in the state sector, which obviously we have direct control over. I would, of course, encourage all private schools, and you're right to highlight that there's been some brilliant examples of what they're doing in terms of supporting children from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'd ask them to look at what more can be done, how we can support children, vulnerable children, and actually, you know, can they play a bigger role in terms of doing that, and not just through this crisis, but also into the future.
But if it is true that they are charging £8,000 for 2 weeks of online A-level tuition, and they can't get their A-level grades unless they pay that £8,000, would you say that's probably bad practice?
What I would say is, yeah, obviously that's a contractual agreement between a private sector employment, a private sector organisation and parents. But, you know, it's absolutely vitally important that all children who want to take their A-levels have the ability to do so, and you know, no one should be held over a barrel in terms of being able to be put into that position of people's future to be threatened.
Thank you. Ian has got a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Secretary of State. Coming back to your earlier responses about what do you think the department can learn from the COVID-19 situation, one of the things which has come to my attention, and I'm very closely connected, so it's not a shock, is that my local authority have had to do an enormous amount of additional work, obviously in adult social care, but also in children's services and resilience planning, and particularly in relation to coordinating what's happening in the education sector. It seems that local authorities still have an awful lot of responsibility, but not so much jurisdiction these days over the different stakeholders which are working out there in the field. Also, on top of that, Secretary of State, my own local authority tell me that while they've been given additional resources, they believe it's only about 25% of what they've additionally spent to cover all of these different responsibilities. Is there anything that the DFE as a department can learn from that and feed back into government?
So on your latter point, the Community Secretary has set out a package of over £3 billion directly supporting local authorities, which is one of the biggest packages that you've seen in terms of direct support for local authorities to help them at this time. And we all recognise the important work that they're doing. And I would certainly hope as that money flows through, those concerns that your local authority have will be alleviated. And I know that the MHCLG are working on the allocations as to what that means for each individual local authority. Separately, in terms of the role that local authorities play in terms of schools, I think they've played a really important role in terms of working with multi-academy trusts, working with individual schools in terms of coordination, and I think we've all truly valued that. And the leadership that we've seen within individual schools and multi-academy trusts to actually provide an access, a route into access to education has been truly inspiring. And I think it's that collaboration that we've seen right across the board has been one of the great benefits.
Caroline, are you there? Can you hear? Caroline Johnson?
Yes.
Would you like me to ask your question? The line doesn't sound great.
I could try. I've got constituents who are stuck at university, and I know you'll know their families. They're often relatively young on their own, and some are getting particularly lonely and talking about them. And what considerations being given by the department allow them to take a single move back home?
Carol, I don't think that came over. Shall I repeat it if you don't mind? Can you hear me, Secretary of State?
Sorry.
I can.
Great.
I can.
What Caroline is asking is she has constituents who are stuck at university, unable to return home to their families and often alone. What consideration is being given to allowing them a single move home should they wish?
Well, I think that she raises, is this for domestic students and particularly, or international students?
I think she's talking about domestic. Yes, she is. Yeah, domestic student.
So I think this is something that we would very much want to facilitate, and we'd sort of certainly hope that students would have been able to return home. Obviously, if there's no issues in terms of safeguarded individuals in that house.
Okay, very, very quick one from Ian, and that will be it.
Yeah, on a similar vein, Secretary of State, is the department doing anything to look at the position of estranged students who are estranged from their own parents, and what support that they're being given at the moment? You know, if the university is closed, but they're stuck in a university town and have nowhere to go back to.
Well, this is why we're very keen to work with universities at the earliest stage to make sure that those youngsters who are so vulnerable would able to sort of stay within accommodation, and that weren't sort of being literally kicked out. And I think it's credit to the university sector how they've responded. It's also really important if we sort of look at a slightly younger age group of those children in care. You know, I've asked all local authorities to make sure that children who are in care, who are coming up to the age of 18 and who are, you know, there could be no worse time to be leaving care than at this sort of moment. And I'm wanting all local authorities to make it absolutely clear to any child who is in care that they do not have to be leaving care, and that they'll continue to be supported at this time. And I think it's these actions that actually will make a real difference to young people and make their future life chances.
So we've just had a last minute bid from Tom. So Tom, please.
It's just I've got a university in my constituency, and I have been contacted by the student union, a number of students who, because there's no courses, it's all online. They're not currently in their student accommodation, and they haven't been for a while, and they won't be for a while longer. So probably about 3 months, 4 months potentially. They haven't been in their student accommodation yet. They're still being expected to pay full rent there. So a lot of them are sort of fairly concerned about that, and I was wondering if the government had a view on that.
So in terms of universities, halls, we've been very keen to make it absolutely clear that we certainly hope that universities aren't charging students for that accommodation. Obviously, in terms of private landlords, the government has set up a sort of a number of schemes in terms of actually supporting people that are in those private agreements, and we very much hope that people look at those as to how they take access to them. But we've been consistently very clear with universities and people who provide halls of residence as to the approach that we would like them to take.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I'm guessing with the announcement now of the new child of the Prime Minister and Carrie, I'm guessing there'll be a big focus on early years with the department in the coming months. But I really do appreciate what you've done, and also we thank teachers and support staff. We also thank the thousands of DfE officials who would be working overtime to try and solve these very, very difficult issues. But I do appreciate you sitting here for over 2 hours answering a sustained barrage of questions on a huge range of issues, and wish you well over the next few weeks. But as you can see, the focus of the committee is on the left behind children and pupils and students, and particularly the faring of how the vulnerable are going to fare in the aftermath of this crisis. Thank you very much for coming today. Order.
Education Committee, 29th of April. 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 Education Committee, 29th of April.